Thank you so much for joining us for our most exciting event, an opportunity for two of our undergraduate students to share their research in conversation with three faculty members on the topic of Jews in the Bronx, oral and archival histories, and to celebrate the launch of Fordham's new Bronx Jewish History Project. I want to extend a very warm welcome to everyone who has gathered here today, both in person and online. Students, faculty members, alumni, friends, and longtime Bronx residents. We're grateful that you're a part of our community. Everyone is always welcome and invited to join us, so we hope that you keep coming. I'm wearing a very special necklace. It's my husband's grandmother's necklace. Grandma Florence, as we affectionately called her, was born on March 3rd, 1919, almost 104 years ago exactly. She grew up in the Bronx and raised her young family near the Grand Concourse until they moved to Muncie in Rockland County in the 1950s. In the decade and a half that I knew her, I loved hearing her stories about her parents, both immigrants from Brno in Eastern Europe, who settled in New York City in the late 19th and early 20th century before World War I. Florence herself was born in America. Her father was a Talmid Chacham, proficient in the study of Talmud and Jewish texts, some of which sit now on bookshelves in my office here on campus, not far from where they were first studied 100 years ago. My father-in-law remembers as a young child watching his grandfather lay tefillin phylacteries every morning and imitating him with his own shoelaces. Florence's brother, Louis Ruchamis, a graduate of City College, Columbia University, and the Jewish Institute of Religion, became a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts and a Hillel director, publishing important works on race, racism, and abolitionism in America, as well as about Jewish history. Florence herself studied accounting at NYU, probably here on NYU's Bronx campus. As one of only a few women in her class, she married the love of her life, Dennis Daniel, who also grew up in the Bronx and raised 3 sons. She lived until a few weeks short of her 100th day. I'm sharing all this with you because the Bronx is full of stories. So many of you here today come with your own memories of the Bronx and connections to the Bronx, whether they're your ancestors or yours. Each student here at Fordham is likewise creating their own Bronx story. Through our new initiative at the Center for Jewish Studies, we're collaborating across generations and fields to collect, preserve, share, and learn from these stories. We're doing so in a number of ways. Through the incredible leadership of Professor Magda Tedder, Shvidler Chair in Jewish Studies and co-director of the Center for Jewish Studies, and with the initial research of Reyna Stovall, we have created an archive of documents about Jewish life in the Bronx, with inspiration from the research that Sophia Maier conducted this past year and the collaboration of Professor Mark Houston, who founded the Bronx African American History Project decades ago here at Fordham. We've begun the Bronx Jewish History Project, which will be directed by Professor Daniel Soyer, to collect oral histories of Jews who grew up and lived in the Bronx. And with the support of the university, we are now working with students to continue this work in the years ahead, and I'm sure we have much in store that we can't yet imagine. I don't know all that much about Grandma Florence's memories of the Bronx, aside from those I've shared with you today. So I wish that that she had had the chance to record her story for such a project so that her memories could become a part of the history of this borough. None of this work would be possible without the generosity and collaboration of so many people and institutions. First and foremost, I thank Magda for recognizing the importance of this work and conceptualizing every aspect of it. We wouldn't be here today were it not for Magda's curiosity about Jewish life in the Bronx and her unceasing energy to study it. Second, I thank Shavak Berleza, our indefatigable administrator, who is instrumental in all of the work that we do. And third, I want to thank our moderator and our speakers, who will be introduced shortly, for their amazing research. We have many co-sponsors for today's event, and I thank them as well. The Bronx African American History Project, Fordham College at Rose Hill Undergraduate Research, the Departments of History, Theology, Anthropology, and Sociology, the Urban Studies Program, American Studies, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and Fordham's Jewish Students Organization. I also want to extend my gratitude to Fordham's Special Events Team and for Center Studies, Henry Miller, Eileen Sutler, Dario Wertheim, the Knapp Foundation, the Pickett Family Foundation, Eugene Shvidler, Bruce Kerrigan, and members of our advisory. We have many upcoming Jewish Studies events this semester, including a lecture next week on Wednesday, March 8th at Lincoln Center by Yana Schmidt as part of our collaboration with the New York Public Library. We hope that you'll join us for as many events as you're able. I now have the honor of introducing our wonderful moderator for today's event. Professor Ayelet Brinn, who will introduce the speakers in a moment, is a beloved member of the community, having served as one of our Rabin-Shvidler Joint Postdoctoral Fellows in Jewish Studies with Columbia University a number of years ago. Today, she is the Philip D. Feldman Assistant Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Hartford. She received her PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania, where she wrote a dissertation titled Miss America, the Yiddish Press's Encounter with the United States, 1885 to 1924. She received an MA from Indiana University and a BA from Brown. She has also been a scholar in residence at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute at Brandeis University and a fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Her book, titled A Revolution in Type, Gender and the Making of the American Yiddish Press, is forthcoming this November with New York University Press. So I'm happy to welcome you back to campus and to have the
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be back here and the conversation with all of you today. So first I'll introduce all four speakers and then they'll give their presentations and then we'll have a little bit of a conversation and then we'll open it up to the audience. Could everyone hear me in the back? Perfect. Okay, so I'll start with Reyna. Reyna Stovall is a current sophomore at Fordham's Lincoln Center campus, majoring in international studies with a minor in Jewish studies and French. Reyna is currently an intern with the Fordham University Center for Jewish Studies, where she has been working with the Special Collections Department and the Bronx Jewish History Project to explore and record the experiences of people who lived in the Jewish communities. Reyna is originally from San Antonio, Texas. And outside of school, she enjoys reading, making playlists, crocheting, and watching Broadway shows. Sophia Maier is senior at Fordham College Rose Hill, with majors in history and American studies and a minor in Spanish. From Monroe, New York, her family traces back to the Bronx over multiple generations and has served as an inspiration for her major theses titled The Promised Land, Jews and African Americans in the Integrated Bronx, 1945 to 1968, and A New Jewish Diaspora, Rethinking Perspectives on Bronx White Flight, 1960s to 1990s, in the fields of history and American studies, respectively. These projects and Sophia's work at the Bronx African American History Project has led her to help create the new Bronx Jewish History Project. Daniel Soyer is a professor of history at Fordham University. He is the author with Annie Holland of The Emerging Metropolis, New York Jews in the Age of Immigration, 1840 to 1920, NYU 2012, and most recently, of Left in the Center, the Liberal Party of New York and the Rise and Fall of American Social Democracy, Cornell 2021. His mother was from the Bronx, but he only works there. Ayala Fader is professor of anthropology at Fordham University. She is the author of Mitzvah Girls, Bringing Up the Next Generation of Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn, 2009, and Hidden Heretics, Jewish Doubt in the Digital Age, 2020. Though her grandfather had a deli in the Bronx, she is from Manhattan and conducts her research in Brooklyn and upstate New York. So Sophia and Reyna will start by sharing some of their work, followed by Daniel and I's reflections about it, conversation among us, and then we'll be open for questions.
So yeah, thank you all for being here. I think that Sari's introduction really kind of went exactly where I wanted to start, which is why in the first place I got interested in this work. And similarly to her story, this all began with an interview with my grandparents about their upbringing in the Bronx for a Bronx history course. Following that, I said, all right, well, this is really important. And so I did my thesis on doing oral history interviews with folks who grew up in the Bronx and left during the period of white flight in the 60s and 70s into the 80s. And so since then, you know, I've done about 40 oral history interviews now, with more coming every day. I'm sure more after this conversation as well. And so it's really great. I mean, I've been focusing a lot on, like I mentioned, the Jewish kind of exodus from the Bronx. But today I wanted to focus on a little bit about what the Jewish experience was in the Bronx for a lot of people that I spoke to. And so this period that we're talking about, that my research focuses on, is you know, the 40s, 50s, and into the early 60s. And so, like in Sarit's case, a lot of those folks are people whose grandparents had immigrated to this country, typically from Eastern Europe. So for those familiar with Jewish history, the late 1800s and early 1900s was that period of mass immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe to the United States, and particularly New York. So for the folks growing up in the 40s and 50s to be their grandchildren, you know, makes sense. And so there has been, since they came to this country, this sort of upward movement, both geographically and on like a class basis, right? So starting out on the Lower East Side or Williamsburg and Brooklyn on these kind of crowded tenement living, folks moved up to the South Bronx or then further up into the Northwest Bronx because they kept wanting bigger space, greener space, air for their families, right? And so a lot of those that stayed in the South Bronx or lived in public housing projects were living in really diverse neighborhoods and really diverse environments. And even for those that weren't going to school, the schools were completely integrated, which, you know, for the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s is really a remarkable thing. And that's not to say that there wasn't some division within that, right? In this, you know, special placement classes that also allowed for kind of, you know, predominantly Jewish white students to be separated from their Black and Hispanic classmates. But really, people were in the streets playing with their neighbors and things like that, right? And I brought, actually, Dr. Fogelman, who's here today, was my inspiration for this, a Spalding ball, or as we would say, which I would say is, you know, a kind of great representation of exactly what we're talking about, right? 25 cents, you have a world of games at your fingertips for these working class kids.
Many a sewer is filled with.
I'm sure there's some today. Haven't decomposed yet. And so, yeah, this kind of working class environment, right, is really representative, especially in the fact that for a lot of people that I spoke to, their parents were kind of manual laborers, right, truck drivers, small business owners, factory workers. But because of the great public education that they got and continued for college education, a lot of the people that I spoke to then were teachers, doctors of various kinds, which I think is really kind of speaks to this continual upward movement and, you know, continuation of that. And it's really highlighted in the public school experience. And so, you know, unlike a lot of the other white ethnic groups in the Bronx at the time, almost everybody that I spoke to was in public school. Even the folks that I spoke to that went to day schools went to public high schools because they were that level. That was, you know, where you wanted to go. And so there was this idea that the public schools were that next step into getting into fulfilling the American dream, right? That was explicitly told to me by Rich Jacobovitz when he talked about Bronx High School of Science. He said this was the first rung on the ladder that represented the American dream. And part of that was also the time period. People like I spoke to Liz, who said how her father had served in World War II, right? And he felt gratified that he risked his life for the freedom and opportunity, right? This was a period of great optimism and coupled with kind of a waning of anti-Semitism that opened up a lot of opportunities, especially in higher education, that didn't exist before. And so there's one quote that I felt I wrote in my thesis that I felt really summarized the general feeling of the Jewish Bronx from Mindy Gilbert, and she said, there was such a wonderful, secure feeling. I think that's the word that comes to mind the most. It was so secure. And it's just not like that anymore. It was, if you were Black, white, whatever, you lived next to each other with so much more harmony than you do now. Or I don't know, I guess everybody had the same kind of standard of life. So I think that quote really stands out to me, especially in the end part about standard of life, because it gets back to what my thesis focused on, was this idea that people were striving towards this like solid middle class standard of life and always striving to improve. And that definitely has a sort of class basis about it as well. People describe the Bronx as a commune without the commune. Right? People were always out there helping their neighbors, even those that lived in cooperative or public housing, even living in these, packed apartment buildings. People are like, oh, I never locked my door, or my Italian neighbor across the street should always give me cookies when I came home. Things like that kind of captures the sentiments of how people were feeling, right? The elderly brought their folding chairs out and sat in the streets or sat in the benches in the Crotona Park. And, there was this like real sense of safety and security. And so, but my focus is how this is the end of the Jewish Bronx, right? This was kind of towards the end of this feeling, and the Bronx was changing, right? That's what people kept repeating, because when the folks that I was talking to were growing up, racism was something else, somewhere else. Segregation was something somewhere else, right? Civil rights were happening elsewhere because they needed to happen elsewhere, right? And one woman I spoke to describes how after Martin Luther King was assassinated, she said, it dawned on me that all my wonderful friends at school who happened to be Black, and I remember a little Italian girl who I really liked, it dawned on me, hey, wait, they don't live anywhere near us. Right? Because the people that I were talking to, they were kids. They didn't think, playing with their neighbors or playing with friends in school, well, why don't they live in my building? They're not thinking about the forces that are going on. So, later with the influx of Black and Hispanic residents, people started to leave. And Co-op City, which we might talk a little more about later, was largely blamed for the deterioration of the Bronx, right? It was new, it was big, it was air conditioned. You had, because it was a co-op, you had a sense of ownership that was, for those especially that couldn't afford to move to the suburbs, was something that a place where they could go. And so, without getting too much into that, I just want to kind of talk about, to conclude about that, leaving the Bronx for a lot of Jews, meant leaving this like distinctly Jewish place. You didn't have to be a religious Jew to be a Jew in the Bronx. And I spoke to one woman, Betty Grossman, who continually highlighted her Jewishness, right? She was very proud of her Jewish identity. And she was the same person that also shared that her family was so secular that they only knew when the high holy days were when they would hear on the radio that opposite side of the street parking lot. But she still has this Jewish identity, right? And I think that's something so uniquely Jewish, and at the same time is a product of where they were living, right? Even Ella Newman shared of her friend Sammy Feinberg, who was a Black friend whose father was Jewish, and so she grew up believing that even the Black kids in her neighborhood were Jewish. It was just that kind of place, and it's really, what comes out of this loss of place is one, a great nostalgia, right? There exists all these Facebook groups and magazines and things about remembering the time. But there's also a great sadness, right? People associate the Bronx with their grandparents or parents that aren't here anymore, or stores and activities and friends that aren't here anymore, which creates sadness from loss of time and place. But there also exists this great pride, right? You know, people have said to me, the Bronx is the only borough with a duh. Like it's the Bronx, you know, there's no duck queens, it's the Bronx. You know, I've been told the Bronx is the center of the universe, so that every day was sunny, right? It's like, that is how people remember it, and it's really kind of fascinating and wonderful to think about the Bronx. Thank you.
So unlike a lot of the panelists here today, I'm very new to the Bronx. Growing up in Texas, you know, I really only knew about Manhattan. The Bronx was, you know, something that maybe had been mentioned in like a New York, you know, history-related textbook that I had read at some point. But I didn't know much about what the Bronx was. And then I came to Fordham, and I am a Jewish studies minor. But I was really interested in the Holocaust. That's kind of been my area of interest for a while. At home, I'm a docent at the Holocaust Museum there, and I've continued that up here. But I was looking for more ways to really get involved in just Jewish history. And I met Dr. Tedder, who was like, oh, we just got these new interesting documents from the Jewish Bronx. And I was like, Jewish Bronx? Like, in Brooklyn. I wasn't aware of exactly the significance of the Bronx to Jewish history. And so I started an internship last semester and really just started deep diving into all of these archives that we had started acquiring. And looking at them was just absolutely fascinating to me. Getting to know people's stories through, you know, the little bits and pieces of their lives that we had. And there's this one family in particular, it was kind of the first batch of documents that we got from this family, the Farber-Meshnicks. And they really opened my eyes to how special the Bronx is. And so I had the opportunity after really working with the archives to talk to the woman who donated all of those documents, Ellen Meshnick, and she knew her parents' stories so well. Even though both of her parents sadly passed away, she knew, you know, exactly when they got here, how they lived, who their friends were, how they met, and getting to know their stories on that level really supplemented my understanding of the archival materials that I'd been trying to pull information out of. You know, we have their high school yearbooks, a lot of their photographs, the stuff that they used to plan their wedding, you know, receipts and their wedding invitation. We have their tuba, you know, little things like that. And so I had this vision of what their life was like in my head. But getting to talk to her, I got to know more of the feelings that were associated with it. You know, how her mother put so much pride in her appearance and, you know, did her makeup this very particular way and, you know, went to these stores to prepare for these certain things for their Shabbat days and, you know, just things like that that showed me the dimension of history. And so getting involved in now oral histories has been absolutely magnificent because I get to see both sides of history, the emotions, the feelings that are associated with the Bronx, you know, how people describe it as being always sunny, but also seeing the archival materials that now we're getting a lot more of, and knowing, you know, the tangible things that we're going to have even after people who've lived in the Bronx passed away. So recently we just got this a trowel and a fun story. So last semester, as I was doing the research, the Center for Jewish Studies organized a little walking tour of the Bronx. And so I had been looking at addresses and trying to map all of the documents that we had. And we went to the Bronx and we walked around and we walked in the Grand Concourse area. And one of the buildings that we came across was the home of the Daughters of Jacob. And, you know, it's just this huge, magnificent building. I don't know if any of y'all have seen it before, but, you know, we turn the corner and it was just there perched on a hill, and the way the lighting was, walked on it, it's like just right in the light. And this woman who was in our walking tour actually realized that her grandparents had been in that home. And so it was a very emotional moment that stood out to me. But this trowel was actually from the laying of the cornerstone at the home of the daughters of Jacob. And so it's a new acquisition that we're going to be adding to our collection. And it's just really cool that now we're getting even more things that have tangible histories of from the Bronx. But yeah, Sophia was talking about the upward mobility that was associated with the Bronx, and knowing the Farber-Meshnick story, that is so central to the documents that we have. I feel like knowing people's motivations from the Bronx. We have this one little booklet, it's an almanac, and it is from a cooperative, and seeing the plays that the children were putting on and the little messages that they had to write in the almanac, and understanding their family's drive to create better lives, paints just such a vivid picture of what their experiences were. There's a few documents in the collection that really just stand out to me. That's one of them. One of the first ones that actually very first one that Dr. Tedder acquired is a bar mitzvah invitation. And that one also was probably one of my favorites just because of the stories behind it. And after we had an article written about the projects that we're doing, the man, his name is Freddie Rothberg, it's his bar mitzvah invitation, and one of his family members contacted us and told us he's still alive, and this was his, and told us a little bit more about his story, and how unique his bar mitzvah was since his death. And so someone had to work with him to teach him his portion. And so it's just having these stories is really special to us. And I'm very excited to continue not only getting to meet the people who lived in the Bronx through our current work, but also continuing to work with the documents that people are sending in and getting to know people that way too.
Okay, so I think our job was we were told we were supposed to provide some context. So, so here's a little context in terms of the neighborhoods, how this fits in. So I think it was mentioned that Jews had been in New York since the 17th century. I'm going to skip ahead. But it's since the 19th century that a lot of Jews in New York, that Jews are associated with New York. And also that's the time when neighborhoods really start to arise in New York, that there's a differentiation between neighborhoods by function, business neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods, entertainment neighborhoods, and also by ethnicity and class. So that's like the middle of the 19th century. But it's really the end of the 19th century when this huge wave, you heard, of Eastern European Jews arrive in New York City, where there start to be Jewish neighborhoods. And that's what for example, you start to see politicians. There's a guy, Eisenstein, he ran for Congress once, he was a German. 15 years later, I think it was 1892, he ran for mayor as he was Jewish, right? Because by that time there's population, and there's also a district. This Jewish district, which means Jewish neighborhoods. So of course, the first one is the Lower East Side. That's famous, right? But really by 1910, the Lower East Side is on the wane. It's shrinking. And where are people going? They're following transportation lines, going over the bridges to Williamsburg, to Brownsville, to other parts of Brooklyn. And they're going up the east side of Manhattan to East Harlem and to the Bronx. especially by the 1920s. So one thing about New York neighborhoods is that they are what people think they are, right? They're not really official, and so whatever people think they are, that's what they are. And as we said, from the mid-19th century, this gets associated with various ethnic groups, class groups, and so on. So it's marked by institutions, right? By businesses, deli, and also just goes on in the street. Like we heard that too, in language, what languages are spoken, and so on. So the Bronx was, people hear about Brooklyn, right? Probably there were more Jews in Brooklyn, but that was just because Brooklyn was bigger. But percentage-wise, Bronx was almost half Jewish, which made it the most Jewish borough. There were some neighborhoods, though, that were more than half Jewish, and this is from like some Jewish social welfare organizations in 1932 via Beth Wenger's book, New York Jews in the Great Depression. Neighborhoods that they called Highbridge, Morrisania, Fordham Heights, Jerome Park, Hunts Point, and Park Versailles.
Parkchester before Parkchester.
Before Parkchester. So these were more than half Jewish, according to these people in 1932. There was also a big variety in the Bronx, right? So the Grand Concourse. So my mother was in the Grand Concourse. I thought they were pretty well off, but actually it was only the 7th wealthiest Jewish neighborhood in the city, behind the Upper West Side. That's not surprising, but a little more surprisingly, the number of neighborhoods in Brooklyn. But also like the 4th poorest neighborhood, what they called in 1930 the East Bronx. Everyone calls things, that's another thing is that each observer calls it something different. So, ahead of Brownsville, Williamsburg, and the Lower East Side, but not much more. So how Jewish, so I have a trick question for you. I'm warning already, it's a trick question. I didn't bring a prop, but I did bring a poem. So here's a poem by Anna Margolin, that was her pen name. The poem is called Girls in Crotona Park. And it goes like this. Girls have woven themselves into autumn evenings as in a faded picture. Their eyes are cool, their smiles wild and thin. Their dresses lavender, old rose, apple green. Dew flows through their veins. Their talk is bright and empty. Botticelli loved them in his dreams. So the trick question is, how is this a Jewish poem? How is this a Jewish poem?
Because it's Crotona Park.
Another,
I'm one of them.
well, I mean, so I didn't give a lot of information there, but first of all, it's by a Jewish poet. Second of all, it was written in a Jewish language. It was written in Yiddish, and therefore it was less tricky. And so therefore also for Jewish leadership. But yeah, this is like the information that undergraduate students never get, which is that the girls are Jewish. The girls at the Park are Jewish girls.
Is the Botticelli to like indicate they're a little Zaftig?
Maybe.
They're a little amongst the
That's-
Italians.
I think it's also Western culture.
Yeah.
Right? But it is a Jewish poem, and I think the less obvious part of it, once you know that it's Yiddish, is that the subject matter is Jewish because this was a Jewish place. Now, the other thing about these neighborhoods in New York is that they changed. And this was, what we heard about. And I just wanted to add one more thing just about that, is that, so a long time ago, Ken Jackson, historian, wrote a book called Crabgrass Frontier about suburbs. And he writes about the Anglo-American, meaning both British and American, not necessarily Anglo-Americans, but preference for a freestanding house surrounded by grass. And that's apparently a deeply embedded kind of preference in this culture. And New York, Jews in New York, and New York Jews, it's like hard to tell, right? Is a little different because in New York, you can move out of the socioeconomic ladder and still remain in an apartment. But it's only different to some extent, right? Because we heard that this is part of it. You're doing better, and that house, the grass. So that by the end of the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, Jewish population was dropping for decades in New York City. It dipped under 1 million, then it started growing. It's over 1 million. It still has more Jews than Tel Aviv and Jerusalem combined. Not so much the Bronx. So, but who knows? That will be the case in the future. That's what.
So I'm going to provide some context too, but probably of a slightly different kind, both personal and I'm going to talk about some very different Jewish communities that might be more familiar to you that I do research with. But first, I wanted to thank you both. Part of my family history was in the Bronx, but until this panel, I really almost never thought about it, which is an interesting thing about in families. This history on whose side is kind of not talked about, and we talked about the Manhattan side, not the Bronx side. My grandfather did have a Jewish deli, and it really called Nathan's in the Bronx, and it really reminded me when you were talking about Jewish culture as secular too, because it was a black kosher deli, but my grandfather always kept a little milk in the cooler for coffee when he did that. So with that, but
Just interrupt for 1 second. When was it?
I don't know. I have to ask. I'm starting to ask my brother some questions now because I actually don't know very much about it. I didn't even know the name of it. I just know that my father worked there for a long time and can still make a beautiful plate of food. That's like very thin, but your questioning has actually led me to be curious, both about the Bronx and where I actually went to high school at Bronx High School of Science, but also family stories and the stories we tell, and importantly too, the stories we don't tell. The stories we tell about my grandfather was that he was a presser in a sweatshop when he came with that generation. He was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, but that they didn't reach that American dream. They died quite early and never moved out to Westchester. So that story ended there, probably way too early. But I was really interested to start to think about my own family in a very different kind of way. I'd like to just point out how important it is that you're both doing oral history and work with objects. I'm an anthropologist, and I also talk to living people, something that you are doing that's very important. Sometimes I talk more to children, but not these days in my work. But I think what's very important that you're both doing is that you're able to touch on the kind of emotional histories of people who might not be in standard history textbooks, right? Like you don't read about the stories necessarily that you're telling or see even the objects in the Jewish Museum. These are perhaps marginalized or quieter voices, and it's really only through doing the kind of research that you're both doing that we really can learn other kinds of histories, that we expand our sense of what histories are. And I think for Jewish studies, that's especially important since Jewish studies has been so text-based. It's been so historical for so long. And so it's really important. I feel like it's my mission as an anthropologist too, to bring in different voices to the Jewish canon, be it women's voices that were often left out, children's voices, to look at objects that are not maybe traditional objects, but deli signs. And in that beautiful room where you have some of those images, you know, with that picture of the Empire State Building next to the Magen David on top of the synagogue, like those are things that we don't always have access to. So it's really important to complexify history and to show the different kinds of experiences. And some of your work actually of anthropologist Barbara Maier who she was a well-known anthropologist writing in the late 70s, who did a groundbreaking study on Jews, elderly Jews, the very old, as she called them, Jews in Venice Beach, California, and they went to a Jewish center. And she also, in so many of their stories, their life histories, she ran an oral history class, and it really changed both the discipline of anthropology, I hope a little bit of Jewish studies, definitely anthropology, by seeing that even within our own cultural context, there were many different kinds of stories to tell. And I think that's very important coming out of your research. In part, I think what motivated me to do my research, which is actually with a different group of Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn, was my own sense of nostalgia, because my father might have worked as a teenager in his father's Bronx deli, but what we really heard about was his earlier years in Williamsburg. And I would go with my Hebrew school classes to go and look, you know, at the Orthodox Jewish, ultra-Orthodox Jewish bakeries there. We would thought we were getting a glimpse into our own pasts. And so that kind of sense of erasure of my past with assimilating grandparents, and a sense that I didn't really know in a way where my family came from, really provoked me to begin to explore. And so all of my anthropological research has been with first Hasidic and now I would say ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jews in Brooklyn. And that's a very different story than the one you're telling. It touches on many of the same issues, especially the American dream and race and class and gender. But the Jews that I was working with and continue to work with mostly came in the 50s after the Holocaust, and they came as refugees. And they came to neighborhoods that were pretty poor, and they came to neighborhoods where other Jews who had been there longer were actually trying to get out. And they especially tried to get out when a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews moved into those neighborhoods. And so while there was white flight to the suburbs, Hasidic Jews in particular stayed put in their urban neighborhoods. There were Black and Latino neighbors. There were many conflicts, some cooperation, but many conflicts. But they stayed in part because it was easier to keep, you know, the kind of broader American culture out when than if they had been living right next to, let's say, conservative or even modern Orthodox Jews. And they were poor, right? They came as refugees, they had nothing. What's really interesting now is, I think, as part of the, if we can even say, but I guess they're still trying to live the American dream, we see a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews moving upstate now and creating their own suburbs, again, having conflict sometimes with their neighbors as they use property rights and buying up land and the legal system. They're very fluent in the American legal system to stake their claims. And it's a really different kind of American dream, but these are actually very American Jews in many kinds of ways, even while they maintain a huge transnational network in England, in Israel, in Belgium, where people get married across boundaries and where business happens across those kinds of national borders. What's really different, I think, from the kinds of Jews that you're talking about is that these Jews do not want to assimilate. Right? They want to keep their way of life. They are one of the few groups of Jews who still speak Yiddish as native speakers. Their children speak Yiddish. Men and women speak different varieties of Yiddish. As Danny pointed out, language is very important here. But in some ways, they could only survive and flourish as they have and have such large families because of the tolerance that they found and the kind of respect for pluralism that they found in the United States. So it's a very different kind of positioning with some similar interesting overlaps, and I'll just stop there.
Absolutely fascinating. I saw a couple of themes come up, and I want to sort of start with a conversation between us before we get to the audience. So one thing I wanted to ask was about sort of method, about oral history versus archives, and within archives, objects and documents, that's something that all of you brought up. And I'm curious to hear what kinds of sources you're finding in both areas, what kinds of information you're getting, how are you triangulating these things?
Yeah, okay. I mean, it was interesting because, you know, for when I was completing my thesis, there was only so much time, right? Only so much reading I could possibly do. And so I really limited myself to the oral history interviews, but sort of with a caveat, you know, it was like, well, I'm going to use oral history interviews for what they're best used for, right? And that is, like we were talking about, right? Revealing feelings, sentiments, you know, emotional moments, personal things that are not going to come across, right, in like a reading. Or so, you know, that was really for me, more so because of time constraints than anything else, why I focused solely on oral histories. But I felt, I can't remember which of you had mentioned it, that it was kind of like that was the point because it was missing from the historical record. I can go back and I could look at the archival research really whenever, right? If I continue it as a project, it's there for me. But it's like these oral histories are things that people have not written down before, have not spoken about before, are going to reveal completely new things to me. And that was really the purpose of focusing.
I think I came from the opposite end of it, where I was working solely with documents. And doing that made me realize a lot of the gaps that we're missing. You know, we have a limited collection. And so when I was doing my research, you know, there was so much we could discover from them. But having the outside information from the people who lived through the history really was vital to crafting an accurate portrayal of what the Bronx looked like in this very specific point. And so now getting more into the oral history side of things, I realized that, you know, it's not necessarily one or the other, that one's better than the other, but that they work in conjunction with each other really beautifully to craft the narratives that we can use for decades and decades to come.
I want to follow up on that topic and hear a little bit more about your process of collaborating in putting this together.
Yeah, sure. Professor Tedder said there's this lovely lady, her name is Reyna. No, she and I met at, when I guess it was last semester, right? And you know, we started talking about the work, but again, we didn't really know each other or anything. So once we embarked on this Bronx Jewish History Project, Professor Tedder had said, you know, I can't do it all by myself. And so, you know, it's been really wonderful working with Reyna and kind of being able to share everything I've learned, even though it's really, I've only been doing this for, you know, 10 months or so. But, you know, I sent Reyna all these recommended readings and things. But it's also, you know, wonderful research. Like we're going on Monday to interview a 99-year-old Holocaust survivor who's been living in the Bronx. And so it's like, actually Reyna's, you know, background in that will be very beneficial for my
And you are both presidents.
Oh yeah.
I'm not president, but we're both on the Jewish student organization leadership groups for our respective. So that's been helpful too. But yeah, I think, you know, Sophia and I working together, we both have our own interests in the topic. And so knowing, you know, different sides of like the same research area has been really helpful, because we can kind of, you know, cross-reference with each other and see what was lacking in our own like knowledge base. And so the readings were very, very helpful, especially for the oral interviews we started doing.
So my next question, I wanted to pick up on something that I heard both Ayala and Sophia say, which is about problems in getting the Jewish Bronx. Are there certain sort of blind spots that you've noticed that you questions about, but that oral histories or artists can't seem to reconstruct?
That, the thing with oral histories too is that we're talking about people and things that happened 40, 50, 60 years ago. So really the issue with that is that, like, of course, people are being truthful when they're speaking, but memories change and they shift over time. It's something that we cannot control. And so it's like if you have a document, the document stays the same, right? I wrote my letter in 1910 and it's still my letter in 2023. But if I'm remembering, something from 40 years ago, there's a chance that how I'm remembering it is not how it happened, or certain, especially negative things take place. Those are not the kind of things that you're going to want to bring up, right? It's like those kinds of things make accessing that a little more difficult. But I do think, especially when it comes to things like race and trying to get an understanding of what was really going on, it's very helpful the fact that we have this variety of oral histories going on, right? So I started doing oral histories for the Bronx African American History Project. And so the first paper that I wrote about Jews and African Americans in the Bronx was actually using African American perspective. I hadn't interviewed anyone. So I was relying completely on that, and it is really helpful to get a variety of perspectives to try and fill in.
Got a follow-up question. Was there anything that people told you that in fact checked out factually? Because this is a big issue right now. Just said, right? It's like memory is as much about the time you are doing the remembering as it is about the time you are remembering. But I've seen things. I don't actually do a lot of oral history because I don't want to talk to people. When I have done also some things for similar, like autobiographies, which are written down with kind of similar. I don't know. I see things that check out, that fine, So I'm actually pro oral history.
Well, so am I.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it is interesting, I guess, when people do provide me with, like, I guess, backup information, so it's like one man I interviewed was like, oh yeah, there was this supermarket behind my house. It was great. Oh, there was actually a fire. It was in the newspaper. And he sent me the newspaper article, things like that. So it happens, but I don't know. I don't know what people are
I have a question, because one of the issue of working with living people is the idea of representation. Like, how do you represent them? So were there times in your research where you had to be really careful how you represented someone's words, like they were racist?
Oh, yeah.
So how did you deal?
Yeah, that was definitely, a point of anxiety for me, especially dealing with, because I focus primarily on white flight. So it's like, if we're trying to uncover the origins of white flight, we have to take race into consideration. And that's one of those things that, generally speaking, people don't really like to talk about it. Like, regardless of what's going on, what the context is, it's much easier just to, so in that case, I was never like super like pushy beyond people's words, but definitely when I was writing the thesis, I started my portion, that talked explicitly about the right flight with, we have to take risks, like flat out, that is part of it. But, what I had written in the thesis was about how that was one part of this larger idea of like middle class status. So it was like, when people were saying, oh, the neighborhood became unsafe, it was like, well, in part, it was because their mom was not. And in part, it was because there are these underlying racial ideas about Black and brown people in my neighborhood means, lack of safety. So it was this balance that needed to be struck, but it was often that, it's much easier to say, everyone was racist and that was that, but that's not, especially when people talk about safety, it was, it was usually because something had personally happened to them.
I guess I want to close our conversation by asking what your hopes are for the
I just hope it grows. I think we're just now starting to get this like upward slope of acquiring, we just got this today.
Yeah.
Getting to dive into them and just creating like something. I'm really excited about that, and I hope that the work continues, even after we've left Fordham, and that it remains an available resource for people. I feel so privileged to be working with these things so new into the project. I hope it continues to produce.
Really just second all of that. It's especially difficult to me because this is my last semester as an undergraduate. I do intend to stay next year because I'll be at Fordham's Graduate School of Education, so I'll be able to continue doing this. But it is like, as I described the other day, it's like my baby, and like I want to take good care of it, but at some point you gotta let it go out into the world. And so, it's been a real privilege to work with Reyna and be able to kind of, know that at least for the following 2 years after I'm done, it will be in good hands. And that it really, I don't know, I just really look forward to speaking with so many more people. Like that has been, like, I'm not gonna lie, transcribing is a horrible business. Like, it takes so long, it's just awful, but doing the interviews is amazing. Like getting to sit down with people over a cup of tea or whatever and just be like, all right, tell me about your life, tell me about your family, that has been amazing. I met all of these, really amazing people. And so my hope for the future is that, other people get to do that, and that all of these, interviews will be available online for anybody who wants to hear them, so that people will continue to discover the same kinds of things.
I just think it's really amazing to make the kind of communication, to make the community across Fordham campus and neighborhood. I can't think of anything more important. We talk a lot about public scholarship these days, and to me, that's really where the responsibility of the university is, to reach out and not just look in, and build relationships both with the past and with the present.
Well, as someone who, I grew up in Queens, and I also grew up in the Bronx until I came to Philly. So I went to Bronx science. But thinking about it, just seeing these projects has really started to make me think more about the Bronx. Like Dr. Fader said, I also have a family roots in the Bronx, but I don't know.
No.
So yeah.
So now let's open it up for questions. If people could introduce themselves when they're speaking, that would be great. I'll try to get.
My name is Amy. I'm interested in what you're doing, and I'm also appreciate this conversation about awareness and other people's as well as this one. And I congratulate you both on your being scholars at such a young age. It's very impressive. And my question for you is how you feel this place that you're in, the Center for Jewish Studies at this Jesuit school, Fordham, I think it's important to bring that sort of into this conversation in some way. And I think it's interesting. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how your Jesuit education led you to this project.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, I was just I just did a little interview with Fordham's marketing people because they're looking to market Jewish students, right? So I think Sari was the one who gave them my information. And I was like, I'm probably the best person to ask about that, right? I am the president of the Jewish Student Organization here at Rose Hill. And so it's been really interesting as someone who's from New York, grew up in a, not predominantly, but very Jewish community, and to be living in one of the most Jewish places in the world and being at a Jesuit school, right? And when I was coming here, people were like, you were doing that? And I'm like, yeah, it's gonna be fine. And it has been, and so I think, the funny thing is that going into it, I kind of imagined my academic life and my Jewish life as two very separate things, right? And that, of course, in high school, there's no way you're gonna kind of combine those things. And so Friday nights, were for synagogue and the rest of the week was for school. But, in coming here, it's like Fordham as a Jesuit school sees religious studies as part of academic life, which is something that I had never thought about. And so being here was like, oh, well, maybe I can begin to examine Jewish life as part of academic life as well. I actually first did that when I took Dr. Soyer's immigration history class a couple of years ago. And that was my first opportunity to be like, oh, wow, like maybe these two interests of mine can converge. And that's really been a wonderful way to examine my own Jewish.
I feel like, okay. I feel like coming from, Texas, it is a very Catholic Christian area. And so being a part of a predominantly non-Jewish community isn't too different for me. And so, that wasn't really a big kind of issue of contention coming here. And I think one thing that Fordham does is, of course, it is, a religiously based university, but the idea of like pure personalis is really at the core of everything they do outside of religion. And so as a Jewish student, I think it's not an issue coming here. It's not like I feel, outside of everything that Fordham is doing, and having some place like the Center for Jewish Studies, it's kind of like a little home base where I feel comfortable being Jewish. I have ways to connect to my Jewish identity, and it is very academic, but I really love and continue